I think that puts me onto a really interesting subject that I actually wanted to talk about this channel for a while. I never really had the time to be able to properly talk about this subject. But talking about the fact that there are these professors and these economists who want to write papers mostly to be famous rather than to specific make predictions or to be right, for example, I think it's worth talking about the spreadsheet error that killed hundreds and thousands of people, right? And that's what it was. It was a spreadsheet error. So I don't know if anyone has heard of the Reinhart Rogoff paper, which was called Growth in the Time of Debt. This paper was released in the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008. And essentially, the paper was a summary of the economic performance of different debt-burdened governments over the course of the last kind of half a century of the economy at the time, so the last kind of 50 years up to 2008. And there was two economists called, I think it was Kevin Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart, and they made the conclusion, based upon the paper that they'd written and the data that they had analysed, that when a country's debt to GDP ratio goes over 60% or so, that reduces the amount of economic growth, and when it goes over 90%, economic growth basically just completely stalls. Right? That is a huge conclusion to make, because it flies contrary to basically a lot of Keynesian theory about the economy, or that you can't go too far with the deficit spending. And it means that essentially it is a repudiation of the idea that you can spend your way to growth. That you can deficit spend your way to growth, and to be able to grow as an economy, you have to make sure that your debt to GDP ratio is as low as possible, is below 60% ideally. Obviously, coming out of the global financial crisis in 2008, in the UK, we did a load of quantitative easing to kickstart the economy from 2008 to 2010, and under Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, and Alistair Darling was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. And this quantitative easing was to put extra money into the economy, to deficit spend, to kickstart an incredibly stagnant economy after the recession following the global financial crisis. And that's the most kind of lefty our economy, or even our prime ministership, the Labour Party definitely has looked, or had looked up until that point for a decade. So the first time they'd ever look, let's just properly use deficit spending to try and influence economic demand, to try and stimulate economic growth, put the money into the hands of the people or whatever. Obviously, that wasn't really how it worked out. The money, a lot of it siphoned upwards regardless, but at least there was a desire to try and stimulate economic growth through deficit spending. And nationalising Northern Rock, exactly. Nationalising NatWest as well, which we are just getting into the portion of selling our shares off, for example, right now. And that was the last time we really had kind of Keynesian theory at the heart of government policy. And this paper, this Growth in the Time of Debt paper by Reinhart and Rogoff, this threw that particular ideology out of the window, even though we'd had kind of appreciable, not massive economic growth coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, right? We had modest economic growth. It not have been huge. But this paper came out and said, look, you can't do this anymore. Debt to GDP ratio is over 90%, going up between 60 and 90%. The only way, right, given the conclusions of this paper, the only way that you can theoretically actually get economic growth out of your economy is through austerity. This one paper wasn't even in a peer-reviewed journal, right? That's the crazy bit about it. If you look here at this here, right? It was published in a non-peer-reviewed issue of the American Economic Review in 2010. It was the one paper that was used to influence austerity politics, and it wasn't even peer-reviewed at the time. That's how crazy this was. And this is basically the root of loads of government during the 2010s engaging in austerity politics. The UK was one of the biggest kind of trials for austerity politics in the UK. And we all saw, right? Gilt yields were at record lows. Did we borrow to invest? No. Did we get economic growth? No. The economy was stagnant, right? What little growth we did have, because the quantitative easing didn't stop, but it just got pumped into the pockets of the rich. Wages didn't go up. The economy got worse. Public services were stripped to the bone. And it was clear that this wasn't working. But of course, nothing can get in the way of the Thatcherite dogma of George Osborne, who was given the biggest gift in the world. That suddenly there was this evidence, there's this magical conclusion that Reinhart and Rogoff had come to with this paper that justified even more public sector sell-off, even more slashing of public services, reducing the big government, quote unquote, to try and bring down the government debt, because that's what the evidence said. That's what they told us. The economists said had to happen. Austerity was necessary to bring the public finances under control, as the Queen was told to say in the Queen's speech, so that the public lived within our means whilst she was sitting atop a golden throne with a diamond-encrusted hat at the time, right? And it was all down to the conclusions of this paper. And it's not just, right? It's not just the fact that there was lack of economic growth. Obviously, this was bad. Economic growth was bad. Depression of wages was bad. This is essentially showing you that conservative economic policy was never financially sound. They've never been prudent financial managers of the country. That's always been a lie. It's never been true. They've always been ideologues looking to benefit the financial sector and to reduce the size of the state, regardless of the negative externalities of either of these things. And there were, outside of the economic consequences, there was a huge human cost to this, right? And this was a study that was posted beforehand, right? It was in 2022 that this was posted. A study found that over 330,000 excess deaths in the UK were linked to austerity, right? This research comes as government signals a fresh round of spending cuts, which we're now going to be getting from, it clears to be, both sides of the aisle, right? The austerity politics are being adopted by both sides of the political spectrum now that we've seen the one fiscally expansionist Labour policy being struck from the books, at least in the first half of the government, as Rachel Reeves has said, because of these nonsense fiscal rules, which, quite frankly, are self-imposed and are economically unsound, given what we know about the failures of austerity politics from during the 2010s. Right? Of course, this study has been peer-reviewed, unlike the one we just saw. But even so, right? There's clearly some evidence here that during this period there was huge amounts of excess deaths in the country that could theoretically be attributed to austerity. Because what's the difference, right, between what's happening here and what happened before then? Which is crazy to think that this, I mean, we all seen the stories, right? We all saw the stories about the people who died due to austerity, due to slashing benefits, the draconian crackdown on the scroungers of the welfare state. We all saw them. And there is at least some evidence to show that this was a contributing factor to a loads of excess deaths in this country was austerity. And it was just this one paper that was used as a justification for the UK government ideologically engaging in this austerity to the detriment of huge amounts of the public. This is literally classicide, quite frankly, right? There's only poor people that died to this. Poor people are the ones who couldn't cool their insulin because they couldn't afford to put their meter on and then died of anaphylactic shock, right? David Clapson, as I mentioned before, right? He's not the only one. This is classicide on an unprecedented scale. I've mentioned it before on stream, I'll mention it again. If you add up the number of excess deaths due to austerity, as this paper has come out with, and you add that on to the people who died during the pandemic, that's more people than died in the Rwandan genocide. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people to die because of the consequences of poor economic management by a party who cared only for winning elections and implementing their ideology than they did about the externalities of the policies that they were pushing. Because they don't care. Because they only care about winning elections. And if they could placate middle-class homeowner-type people with promises of welfare budgets being reduced to stop the scroungers, they would do it. And this is the brutal and murderous result of that ideology. Which is really sad that just one unpeer-reviewed source could lead to this much misery in one country. And there's one thing that comes off the edge of this, right? The paper was wrong, right? The paper contained a huge error that essentially means that the entire study is proved bunk, right? A student caught them out in 2013 that they'd forgotten to shift some Excel squares down five lines, 5 rows in the spreadsheet, and had completely nullified all of the data they'd come out with in this study. This was back in 2013, and this was just kind of buried, really. This was on BBC, but I heard no one talk about it at the time. Economists have been astonished to find that a famous academic paper, often used to make the case for austerity cuts, contained major errors Another surprise is that the mistakes by 2 eminent Harvard professors, no less, were spotted by a student doing his homework. And there has been, since then, there has been an unpublished study, a recent meta-analysis that's not been published yet, providing evidence that there is no threshold above which a higher debt-to-GDP ratio reduces GDP. Nothing at all. There is only a bunch of random hypotheses, and there's been no structural proof of any of this stuff. But after the methodology that suffered from 3 major errors here, does not support the conclusions. And you know what takes the fucking cake after all of this? Of all the people who have died due to this awful ideology that was precipitated by 2 economists out of Harvard, who made a very, very major error, a stupid error no less, that could get spot by one of their academic students at Harvard. Could lead to so many deaths, and there's no contrition about that. They've never, ever, as Gary's Economics pointed out in the segment that we just watched, there's never any punishment for failure for these people. And there should be punishment for failure for these people, because guess where Carmen Reinhart is now? Guess where Carmen Reinhart is right now? One of the major authors of this paper. She is the chief economist at the fucking World Bank. Right? If you've watched the interview with Matt Kennard on Joe Politics and on Novara Media, you'll know that the World Bank have been responsible for so much terrorizing policy of structural adjustment programs being forced upon developing countries in the third world by advising them to get into bed with corporations to essentially just decapitate their own welfare state and justify market liberalization through these kind of structural adjustment programs. The World Bank has been essentially debt trapping nations in the global south ever since its inception, along with the International Monetary Fund, to embed neoliberalism globally. And that's where the person who wrote this paper, Carmen Reinhart, she's the chief economist for them right now. There is no punishment for failure for these economists. But the punishment is meted out upon us. When they fail, we are the people who then bear the brunt of it. And that is the story of the Excel error that killed hundreds of thousands of people. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.